You can hear us now, seeing folks joining by audio. We are very grateful for all of you joining us, especially we know that December is a crunched time. But we know that this was a topic that was interesting to a lot of people. We had a very high registration. So I am Shannon Rudisell. I'm the Executive Director of the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our webinar, Learning from Decades of Collective Action, the BUILD Initiative and the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative. And I will tell you why we are doing this. We are doing this because it is the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative's 30th birthday this year and the BUILD Initiative's 20th birthday. And that is not a coincidence because we are linked. Our histories are integrally linked, which you're going to hear about today. And as we've been doing our birthday reflections and celebrations here at Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, one of the things that we've been thinking about is the role the collaborative has played over the 30-year history and what that means for us going forward and the kinds of catalytic actions we can take together. And there is no more catalytic action that the Early Childhood Funders have taken together in the entire history of ECFC than the initial work to seed the BUILD Initiative, which you're going to hear about today. We're incredibly proud of that work and that we have these linked histories. And it's really, for us, a touchstone for what we can do when we work together and what we can do going forward. So I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Susan Hibbert, the Executive Director of the BUILD Initiative.
Hi, thanks, Shannon. Hi, I'm Susan, as Shannon said, and I was excited to see those of you a minute ago who were joining. I saw some of the first leaders in the first BUILD states 20 years ago joining. I'm just going to start by saying a few words about the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative when I first met them during BUILD's prenatal period 21 years ago. And when I met the ECFC, I met them as a group marked by four values. The belief that philanthropy can do better together, this incredible yearning to keep learning from each other and to learn from the other national organizations, from state and community leaders, and this, real willingness and wanting to support opportunities for organizations and leaders in states and communities to learn from each other as well. A value in, and an understanding that philanthropy is better positioned to take risks than the public sector is, and that those risks are opportunities for learning and opportunities to create change and are necessary, and a feeling of partnership with grantees rather than as a group. Each funder as an individual and their foundations had ways of being, but as a group, ECFC had a sense of how can we be partners with grantees? And this particularly was played out as ECFC designed BUILD. How can we create something where we're not telling states and grantees what to do, but partnering with them as learners? So, just to say another word about how those values played out in the birthing of BUILD, Deb Stahl was at the Lucent Technologies Foundation and Michael Levine at the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And they commissioned the Child Care Action Campaign and Families and Work Institute to undertake a research project, which was 65 interviews of all kinds of leaders, state level, some community level, national organizations, researchers, evaluators, all different kinds of people, and with the goal of, asking people, getting at what would be the next steps, what would be the way to take on strategic work to promote a universally available, high quality early childhood education for all families. And the product was called Designing a National Early Learning Initiative. And that product and idea was the beginning of Build. And that idea was brought to ECFC because they were members of ECFC and they believed that philanthropy could design it better together and do it better together. So that was really how I met ECFC and what they were like during those times in 2000. Shannon?
Thanks, Susan. And I think you could hear from that introduction that Susan's history with ECFC goes all the way back to the beginning, and she and Deb Stahl over many years helped pull together and manage and coordinate and facilitate the strong relationships between the funders that I benefit from today and get to foster and continue to push forward. So we're excited to turn it over to a group that's going to discuss this and also the continuous learning position that both Build and ECFC have strived to maintain over the years. Our discussion is going to be moderated by Portia Kennel, the former senior advisor at the Buffett Early Childhood Fund and co-founder of the EduCare Learning Network, who just recently retired, but was such a valuable contribution in all of these spaces, made so many contributions that she was so generous to say she would come back and facilitate this conversation for us. And we also have Sherry Killen-Stewart, the Director of Systems Alignment and Integration at Build, Sarah Slaughter, the Executive Director of the W. Clement and Jessie B. Stone Foundation. She was an original Build funder at the Robert M. McCormick Foundation and is a current Build funder in her current role. And Phyllis Glink, Executive Director of the Irving Harris Foundation, who was an original funder of Build and has been with Build and with ECFC this entire time over the long haul. So Portia, thank you so much. We look forward to hearing the conversation.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. It's like an reunion. We've all been on the battlefield of early childhood for quite a long time. I hate to think of how many years are represented by us alone and all of them on the call. Oh my God, it's a wealth of information. Hello, everyone. As Shannon said, I'm Portia Kennel, and I'm going to attempt to facilitate this discussion today. So let me just give you a preview of what we thought we'd do today. We've had several conversations with ourselves, and we have the major players, the birth creators, developers of this, and we're going to try to do three things. One is we're going to go a little bit over this birth situation because we have to talk about what were the circumstances and situations that led to the creation and the need for creating Build. And then we're going to talk about the role of equity in that process. What happened? How did we develop? How did we approach equity in it? And then we're going to have a free-for-all discussion where we're going to really lift up what were the critical factors in this past 20 years of experience that we need to take forward as we continue to develop systems and continue to address issues within the early childhood field. And there have been some lessons learned in our discussion, and we want to make sure that all of you listening get an opportunity to talk about those. We're going to share from our speakers what they think, and then we're going to open it up for about 10 or 15 minutes to take your question. Then we're going to summarize, and then I'm going to turn it over back to Shannon. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. Let's start. Susan already told you from her perspective, being there at the beginning, what the circumstances of birth that she thought was important. I want to ask our speakers, Phyllis and others, what else around the creation of Build or led to the creation of Build that you think is important for our audience to know right now?
Thanks, Portia. I'll start. I'm actually proud and a little bit like freaked out that I have actually been a member of ECFC for almost 27 years. So almost its full lifespan. And my predecessor, Ruth Bowser, was part of it before I was. So it has really evolved and grown over the years. And when I began, some of these initial conversations were already starting around what could we do together to really support moving and early childhood agenda, set of services, set of systems and states. And that led from, as Susan said, from this report to this idea of systems building. Our foundation particularly, and I think every member of ECFC thinks of the work they do as having a broader impact than just in the regions and areas in which they invest specifically. And that's a tenet, I think, that remains of ECFC, that people who are part of it are trying to think of and hold a whole. And systems building, while not sexy, is an essential and critical component. And thinking about how one leverages private resources to leverage public resources, I think is also a key element of what ECFC has always been about. So Build became a passion project for all of us who were there, a number of us who wanted to work together to think about how collectively we could conceptualize and think about what it would mean to invest deeply in this kind of work in states. And so I see a lot of people on this phone who were around for much of these years as we were doing this work. And I think really at the end of the day, the nature of the conversation, the meaningful relationships we were creating through meeting with each other at ECFC, meeting with our colleagues and our peers in the field, was that we wanted to be as responsive and receptive to what states needed and what advocates needed and others working in states needed to better help them advance the work that they were doing. And so we developed this concept for state-focused work, always with the idea it would have a larger national impact. Things changed at the beginning. Deb's on, we had a lot of national funders when we first started having a conversation about Build. By the time we got it together, and we'll talk more about what it took, Sarah can speak to that. We had more state-based funders. And so it's interesting to see how over the years we were able to get back to what the core original sort of idea was for what Build could be for the nation and for states, and for really trying to leverage best practices. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Susan or Sarah.
Susan, would you like to add some more about the beginning, birth and development? What were the critical factors?
I mean, I think it was a time when the funders in the field were so clear about the brain science and the importance of the early years and funding. There had been a lot of great foundation funded efforts that were successful, but in many ways unsatisfying fully, because each one was discrete, and there was a clear sense among the ECFC who were really thoughtful and smart and, wanting to think about, they were change makers and what more they could do. And they recognize, yes, this professional development effort that I'm funding is great, but still compensation is a huge problem. And we've expanded these seats in this program, but we're doing nothing about dental care in the state. Everyone was thinking about all of the pieces, and to fund a good effort on one piece when other pieces weren't being talked about or they were being talked about, but there was no connection, was very frustrating and unsatisfying. So I think in a way, this was sort of a dream conversation. It was a sidebar that they did together that maybe they couldn't have done alone. One state foundation couldn't have done it alone, but many of them could together. And as Phyllis said, it started out with some national foundations. Lucent started out with a big pot of money, but had no money by the time it was launched. So I think the brain science was huge. The recognition that, the belief in a whole child, whole family, whole systems approach. I think ECFC as a whole was a group that really thought globally, recognized that the US was really a laggard among industrialized countries, that there was no family policy. And, Joan Lombardi had already been in the Clinton administration, had been at the Child Care Bureau, and there had been these big hopes and statements to federal administrations that hadn't led to all of the changes that were wanted. And so this was sort of like a side dream where a risk was taken because there was no mandate given to the states. It was really, let's let people try. Let's give states that have some level of readiness. And Ann Mitchell and Louise Stoney had done a scan of all the states, and there were some criteria for readiness, but also there were local funders who were willing to buy in. So initially, and ECFC had an earlier pooled fund, and the experience of pooling money hadn't gone that well. They hadn't felt good about the way it went. So this one was done in a more, you can opt in. Everyone designed it, but you didn't have to pay in. So it started with people opted in to pay. Everyone could design, but you opted in to pay if you wanted to. And it just started with, 11 funders and then 12, but 4 states, and really state funders leading the way.
The partnership and the understanding of the invisible thing called the glue that holds it all together. And also, I think you were alluding to funders had to think about things a little bit different. When you're doing a pool funding as opposed to a specific project, what are some other things that you think in the beginning were critical? Things that maybe were somewhat of a conflict, but you overcame them? Because evidently, 20 years later.
Yeah, I'll jump in with a little bit just to amplify some of the points that were made, because I think there's been a lot of talk about relationships and partnerships. And, I think that it makes me think of the saying that, change moves at the speed of trust. And, I think particularly in the times that we're in now, that, all of us being in separate places, literally and figuratively, that those relationships matter. They matter a lot. And that ECFC, really incubated the relationships and the trust amongst national, state, local funders, and that everyone had something to contribute. Yes, it was, money, yes, but it was more than money, right? Who do you know who's doing what, where, and doing it well? And then how do we lift that up so that everyone brings something to the table and beyond money? And even if you weren't one of the build funders, you probably knew what was going on, doing well, and how do you bring that forward? And so I think that's really important as we move forward in this time. And then also that relationship with our public sector partners, and including, yes, it might be the head of an agency, but it also is like the folks underneath who are doing the day-to-day work. And also, if there's a change in administration, those folks are the ones who are likely to stay. And so I think it's that recognition, too, of everyone has a piece of the puzzle, right? And when we put those pieces together is when we're going to maximize opportunities. And you mentioned the glue. And in many ways, we were able to get our boards to support the glue. And if you're building something, we all know that if you don't have glue, it's going to fall apart. But yet, if you do it right, no one sees the glue. And so you have to find a way to get your board to see the value of the glue, the things that hold it together in the long run. And I think that we were able to do so, and it's sort of this conversation is a good reminder of how we need to carry that forward, as you might say, Portia.
And we had mentioned earlier, I want to bring in the equity part of this, because we mentioned earlier, Susan did, about we were for all children, this will equalize everything for everybody. And I want Sherry to speak to that, about what did you learn about that position? Did it work, and what happened? And where are you now around centering equity as a part of BUILD?
Thank you so much. And first of all, I want to thank ECFC and Bill because they're part of my success as a former commissioner. One of the things that Bill was able to do for leaders like me and continues to do for leaders across the country is create a firewall by organizing the support that you can get from foundations that sometimes as a state leader, you can't go directly after. When Massachusetts was applying for Race to the Top, it was Susan who reached out and said, hey, what do you need? Really, I think about it continuously as back office to help leaders be successful. So I want to give you a couple of examples about the journey around equity, but first grounded in the why. As they have said, the idea was that all children would be better off if we created early childhood systems, but we realized there were some communities and some children today and historically that did not have access to state opportunities due to policy, practice, or selection ideas that they were intended to benefit from. And as a state leader, I could tell you some of those reasons why we didn't reach those children. And we decided that what we meant by equity, because we throw that word around without a shared definition, is getting opportunities to children, removing barriers. And I say children, families, the workforce, removing barriers. It meant redistributing resources. And so often foundations and states alike get in a routine about who we fund and how we fund, and then monitoring to make sure that we were getting the change that we said we wanted. So it was really connecting intentional actions to the full early childhood system. As was mentioned, it's not just about early learning, but it is about health, it is about workforce, it is about public safety. So some of the things that we didn't do well in the beginning, and I'll tell you how we've shifted or did in a different way in the beginning and learned from, is we connected to leaders that were mostly appointed. And Sarah started to talk about that. And at that time, and sometime today, that is a set of mostly white leaders and not necessarily representative of the children and families that we're intending to reach. We led with data, but we didn't always pay attention to the disaggregation and look at the disparate impacts. We didn't bring the voice of children and families front and center. We thought leaders had come from places and would be listening in their own states, but we didn't ground our work. So a couple of shifts we made. One, we went as Build from talking to 2 appointed, usually leaders, to talking to 8 leaders in state. This did 2 things. It allowed for diversity of the team. It allowed for cross-sector, the way Sarah talked about. You had to have all the sectors and you had to have multiple levels. By us being willing to invest and funders allowing us to invest in larger teams when we were doing conferences and meetings and bringing people together, we took a step towards equity. We began to talk about barriers for Black and Brown leaders. Dr. Aisha Ray and I brought together a group of leaders that were Black and Brown, Latino. I don't remember if there were Native American leaders in the room, and said, what's going on? And we used that to have the privilege of being funded by the Kellogg Foundation to start an Equity Leaders in Action Network. And we are very practice-based. So we wanted to know, what are you doing within your roles, responsibility, and authority? How can we intentionally support you to take action forward? So beginning by listening and then creating a diverse, it was important that the Equity Leaders in Action represent leaders in state systems across the country, state, county. We had a territory in the first round. We had a Native American leader. Which brings me to, we started to be more intentional about the Native American community. People don't recognize the number of tribes that are both recognized and non-recognized, and we're still on that journey of continuing to center their experience. It's often easier to find data or information about a Black community. We hear a lot about language in the Latina and Latino community, but we're working hard to center the experience of the Native American community. We brought voice into our meetings, first by bringing speakers in places like Illinois that had groups that were organized, parents and advocates to come and talk to our leaders. But we got better after learning through the ELAN that going out, we travel, we do multiple meetings, bringing people together. Why aren't we taking advantage of learning in those spaces? And that gave a firewall for leaders to be able to listen and learn from the workforce, from families, from community efforts. And then we also created a series of protocols, which we're using around understanding and listening to root cause around data, around working with people, programs, and structure, taking that foundation that was built early and breathing life into it around specific children and families, really paying attention not only to qualitative data, but to quantitative data and qualitative data. The stories matter as much as the numbers. So those are just some examples. We're constantly working on this alone and together with funders to make a difference and really reach those children and families in the workforce and ensure they're benefiting from what is already available.
Now, I'm going to open it up, and we've mentioned several things here. We talked about the importance of relationship. We talked about partnership. We talked about how we had to come together enough to admit, even when we did the equity, that we didn't approach it right, that universally non-intentional actions is not going to get to the children and families that we want to serve. So now let's open it up, group, and let's really think and articulate for those in the audience, what were those key takeaways that they need to know in their communities and in their states about what we've learned over the last 20 years. We've learned about relationships. We've learned about partnerships. We've learned to self-correct when we know that we're not getting to the audience of children we need to get to or families. What else is critical for folks to know about this 20-year experience and journey that you guys have been on? And we've been on it with you.
So I'll lean in here if that's okay.
Okay.
I've been listening to what everyone has had to say, and I'm going to use the example because it's really the way early ECFC and Build really worked together. So when we had I think part of it is remaining flexible and responsive, and that requires you to already have relationships in place that are trusting. So Susan and Sarah, I think, referenced this. When we had a new president in Obama, we saw an opportunity as funders to intentionally think about how one expands the conversation from just pre-K to a more prenatal to 5 framework, which was something that was central to ECFC and the way that the funders of ECFC held the concept of early childhood. And we also pushed for the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grants so that we could do systems building in states. And I think without Build having existed and the work that our partners had been doing in states, that concept wouldn't have even been something that I think would have been in the ether. And then the last thing I'll say is we were, as funders, able to get together a pooled fund that very quickly raised a ton of money to be able to do the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative. That was then co-headed by Build, the Alliance, with input from Start Early, then the Ounce of Prevention, and I'll never
Which we'll all say forever until there's none of us alive.
Nonetheless, the point is that if we hadn't had the relationships, the shared learning, the thought, collaboration, and partnership that had existed in ECFC, we hadn't come together and put Build in place and invested in some of these core organizations that were poised and ready, we would not have been able to be as opportunistic and take advantage of moments when they arise, and also help those moments arise. And I think that's a real lesson to be learned, which is you can't just assume you can jump in when a moment happens. If you haven't done all of that groundwork and softening of the soil, you haven't built those relationships to be able to pick up the phone and call your colleagues in the field or call and say, let's do this together. If we didn't already have public-private partnerships with our state leaders who wanted to back this and help this be successful and lean in and put those applications and proposals together. And I think that crowning moment, which we see the reverberations now 12 years later of the work that went on there and the vibrant work that's currently going on around state systems building. And you can carry the threads back to those early days of what we had in place, where we saw opportunities, how we remained flexible and responsive, and had and built on the relationships that allowed us to do it. So I guess to me, Portia, that is an example of what are the takeaways that today a funder or organizations could think about. It would be great if whoever, could you all mute your phone? Could you all mute your phones, please?
And
I'm going to stop there and pass it off.
Okay.
I will sort of build on what
Sarah.
Phyllis said, and just sort of talk about it, you know, from the frame of patient capital, right? So investing over the long haul. And I say that because I think in philanthropy, oftentimes, you know, when you think about the incentives that we are supposed to, as Susan said at the top of our Zoom, we're supposed to be the risk takers, and we're supposed to be the ones that take the long view, right? Because government can often only take a 4-year view, and they can't take risks. So that's supposed to be our role as this sector. But if we're honest, that oftentimes the incentives are not to do that, right? Because oftentimes, you know, we can have boards or cultures that are risk adverse, or that sort of push us to show some, you know, bright, shiny success in this course of a 2-year grant, right? And while we need to sort of, talk about the success and the progress and satisfy that itch, we also need to make sure that we're doing what I think Phyllis has described, which is this patient capital over time. Because when we do it over time, we build the systems, the glue dries, and then we are nimble when there are things like Race to the Top, or most recently, some of the COVID relief funds that came down, and being positioned to know what to do when those opportunities come. So again, I think that that's something that, it's a good reminder, I think, for at least for me, to really think about how we, maintain that patient capital and keep the long view while keeping our boards engaged and happy in the short run.
Yes. Other critical lessons learned that we want to take forward and lift up from this 20-year experience.
Portia, I wasn't there back then, but one thing that I'm listening and reflecting on, what I think really holds true for ECFC today, and I can see some of the folks who are on the phone now too, this idea that there's good things happen when state or regional or local funders and national funders come together. And I mean, hearing the story of, I almost envision like a ball of yarn being tossed around, and sometimes one will be in the lead, and sometimes, I'll catch it. No, you catch it. Okay, I don't have as much, and it's one thing to think about the national funders getting together to do that. And it's another thing to think about people in a state getting together to do that. But at ECFC, one of the interesting things about our table, and sometimes we kind of stretch to figure out exactly how to manage it all, is that we have both the national funders and state funders and local funders sitting at the table. And increasingly we have state early childhood funders collaboratives growing up at the state level, and I know we have some of them with us on this Zoom. And I think there's a growing movement. We've been at ECFC called at least twice in the last 2 or 3 months by people who are trying to start them in their states. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's an interesting way that the threads, the lessons, kind of people watching what was able to happen through this collaboration is continuing to spark more action.
I think the other thing is that ECFC nor Bill approach you with a way to do the work, but rather a set of values. And I think we've got to hold on to that. It allows state leaders to be able to fail forward. It allows states to have different kinds of infrastructure. Some have governors' cabinets or early learning councils. And as leaders, when we're approached often, we have to negotiate all that kind of in order to be able to move forward. So the ability to really lead with a set of values and then co-create and be comfortable when it doesn't go the way we exactly expected it is the critical piece to hold on to and carry forward. And I think it fits with Sarah and Phyllis's comments about patient capital. So patient capital doesn't mean it's working all the time. It means that we're staying on the train to destination.
Yeah, and one of the things that I don't think was said clearly, I'm pretty sure this was true for any state where Build has worked. It certainly was true for Illinois. We already had a lot of public-private collaboration and partnership going on in Illinois. But what Build did was, it's not just philanthropy and the government sector, it's philanthropy, the nonprofit, advocacy, grassroots, parent community, and Build and the government working together on teams that were intentionally supported and created with co-leadership from the public and private sectors to identify what particular needs and supports particular states needed at a particular moment in time. And Build in its structure, which has lots of different consultants with different levels of expertise, were able to be responsive in a more exquisite and particular way to what particular states needed, and then took that information and lifted it up and made it available broadly to all states over time. That was always the goal. It didn't start that way, but I think over time, and the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative was maybe motivator for moving to that 50-state structure even quicker than we had hoped. But it's this notion that in states too, it was building tables, and it was building the muscle of how one works across these sectors and these stakeholders to really create relationships that then allow for ongoing support in states and more input really and engagement. So I don't think we explicitly have said that, but that is an element of this work that I think is really important, and it's important to funders. It's also important in states to those collaborators and partners who are building and doing the work.
Yes.
I want to say a few things to respond to a bunch of different comments. Just on the last one that Phyllis raised, I think some things about Build have remained true from the beginning and are sort of constants. A lot of that is the values, the sort of culture, the values, I think. And then some things have changed, and I think that they relate both to what we're learning and to the context that we're living within. So I think the Head Start reauthorization and Early Learning Challenge changed the context that we were in, and the states had new homes for early childhood systems building in the public sector that didn't exist when Barbara Gebhardt was the director of Build, and the staff was 2 part-time consultants besides Barbara, Deb Stahl, and me. So that's all there was. And at the beginning, and that was the context. It was really, the ounce of prevention was the home for systems building in Illinois. There wasn't an early learning council yet in 2002. And so it's a totally different context in terms of public-private roles. They're different now. So our relationship to public and private is different now. I think that that's the main reason. But I think, so some things have changed, and I think a lot of the big things, I think, have stayed the same. I think just in terms of the nimbleness, I think one of the important lessons is, and I think it has to do with both with the kind of grant making that we had at the beginning and that we sometimes have now, but that is rare. It has to do with trust, but I think it also has to do with unrestricted money or flexible money, which is so hard to get, and so much, I think, worth so much more than very restricted money, because you can't be nimble if you don't have any flexibility. You can't respond to situations. And I think that that's true with our relationship with the states early on. When we were giving them money, they could be nimble and respond to their changing environment. And then in response to just sort of what we learned about race and racism and centrality of race in the early years, I think we knew a lot much earlier than when we dramatically changed in terms of sort of centering a racial equity perspective. By year 3 of Build, we were working with Betty Emerita in Minnesota, and interviewing cultural communities to inform the early learning standards in Minnesota. And in 2009 or 8, I think it was, we were supporting Michigan. The Early Childhood Investment Corporation was working with Valora Washington, and she held community conversations in 11 communities in Michigan that were Native American communities, urban and rural, and African American communities and migrant families. And it was really a listening tour of communities to really hear better what were people wanting for their children, how did they define success and thriving, with a real understanding that what we had thought was quality or thriving or kindergarten readiness was not a universal concept or definition, but was a, cultural concept that had been imposed as universal. And so there's we knew a lot was wrong about our original concept, and we had been working with the Race Matters Institute from 2008 on, but we hadn't centered any of that. It was sort of like parallel play in a Piaget model. We were parallel playing. And I think, I give credit to the Kellogg Foundation that really had been funding our racial equity work. Annie, Casey, and Kellogg had been funding us to work with states on many of these racial equity issues, and finally said to us, we're not going to give you another grant to do this work unless you do work internally. And I thought, I can't believe we have to waste our time on that. And I fought and fought and fought. And then they just said, well, you can take it or leave it. Either half the grant goes to internal work or you don't get a grant. And I said, okay. And it was the best grant. It was really important. They said we could do it how we wanted, and it took us a while to figure out how we wanted, but I think it made us figure out how to not do parallel play and how to, instead of complaining about things that had been wrong from the beginning, how to not whine about them, but change things so that we were actually addressing them. If the two agency leaders or the head of every major, advocacy organization, if they're all white and that's how you've defined the leadership of who's going to be on your team, then change something. Don't just keep saying the teams are white. So I think, and obviously then Sherry joined the team. That had a huge impact as well. But, it really was, we'd been learning things. We just hadn't integrated it. And sometimes you need a kick. So you do need unrestricted money. Sometimes you need a kick also.
Kick is good sometimes. I want to stop for a
You're
moment.
on mute,
Portia.
Portia.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm not on mute. Can you hear me?
I can hear.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I'm
not on mute. This is great, but I want to stop so we can have time to invite our listeners in on this. And please put your questions or comments in the chat. I see Brian stepped right up to the plate and he said, this is all good. He's new to the state collaborative process, but he's curious about how long it took to identify the idea and how do you manage the time it takes to getting a final result? How did you manage that? So does anybody want to take that question on?
I mean, I'm happy to start. Sarah may want to chime in, and Susan. Big lesson learned, bring in a facilitator and consultant sooner than later, because funders, well, we redid it all at the beginning ourselves. We brought, we traveled, we got together, we sat around tables, we brainstormed, and that was a lot of conversation, and it's a lot to get the whole group together. And as Susan, I think, said, or Shannon, we wanted Build to be a whole project of ECFC and not the project of some of ECFC. And so structurally that required us, and I think it was the right decision. And in fact, ECFC every year through its annual dues put a grant into Build as its contribution to Build as a member of Build, a funder of Build, even though many members of ECFC were not direct funders of Build. Many of us were, and some of us were not. And I think that really served us well. And it slowed you down because you had to go back and vet ideas with the whole group and do that learning. I think it served us over the long term better. But in a state, I think having a really smart facilitator and person who's helping you develop the model could help facilitate focus groups and the kind of input you would want to gather from a diverse set of stakeholders in your state, and help the process probably go more smoothly, and also help facilitate the negotiation between funders. Sometimes that's all funders have to do it, but don't forget, we all have our own boards, we all have our own priorities. So you have to get to a place where you can all agree to core values or core principles of what you want to see and build, and where you can be flexible enough to allow for interpretation and needs to be designed by the community. So I guess it took a while. It could have probably gone faster, I think. But, I think the process we went through was very thoughtful and collaborative and inclusive.
And I would just name that as the tension between patience and urgency. And it's real. And I think recognizing that tension and constantly trying to juggle and balance that is important. But also things didn't stop. People were doing their individual work while this was being built and developed. So, but I think it's a something that, and particularly as folks do equity work, that tension has to be reconciled with. So.
Great. Anyone else? Questions in the chat box. I'm watching and I see Barbara had a comment. Things have changed, but we must stay the course, Barbara. All states need support. Agreed. And
I think Barbara's right. A lot has changed in commitment to systems building at the state level, and PDG grants have continued to allow for some of that work. Again, I'm not going to say Build and ECFC gets all the credit for all of this work, because systems building is happening in states long before we got involved. But I do think that the race to the top, the PDG grants, are part of a larger set of intentional efforts among all of our stakeholders to lift up the importance of systems building, which is not very exciting, in general, but is essential. And I said right before this call that we are also focused at our foundation on advocacy efforts and on grassroots movement building much more intentionally, and community-driven solutions. And all of those groups are pushing for new policies and higher investments in early childhood. You need to have functioning systems that are open and ready to receive and use those policies and those resources really to make a difference on behalf of all children. And so that requires systems building. And so that all these pieces are connected, and we have to be thinking and holding all of them at the same time.
Other comments and responses?
Well, I was going to add something. Susan talked about sort of the values, and she made me think of the fact that, both in the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative and Build, I think there was also a common culture, a culture of respect. And I think when we talk about, Phyllis talked about not everyone was a direct funder, but, it was structured in a way that even if you weren't a direct funder, you were part of it and you were part of the conversations. So there was a respect and inclusiveness both at the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative and Build. And I think, by virtue of, as evidenced by this conversation today and some of the things that Sherry and Susan pointed out, humility, right? To be humble and realize that we didn't get everything right at the outset. and because that humility allowed that learning and that evolution. And so anyway, I wanted to point that out because I do think that that culture, creating that culture, was also a really important thing that goes hand in hand with the values.
Yes. Yes. Any other thoughts?
Anne, did you want to say something?
I just dropped it in the chat. I just a note of gratitude, and a lesson that I've always sort of carried with me from the early work was the approach, right? And how you came and just sat at the table with us. I remember one of the very early planning meetings in Illinois. We probably had 30 folks in the room. Phyllis, it might have been at the Standard Club, and Susan and Barbara and Deb, you were there. You weren't the center of the show, right? You were sitting at the table with us. And I remember the sessions after where you just had such valuable insights and were really willing to be flexible and supportive and respect where we were. And some of the systems building work we had just gotten underway before we had the chance to meet you was focused on prenatal to 3. And this really gave us the chance to expand that to age 5 and to really think much more robustly about how to engage the private sector and a lot of that systems coordination work. Because I think, as you said, the locus at that time was more in the nonprofit and advocacy community in terms of where the leadership was coming from to push forward on early childhood. And over time, we were able to sort of shift that, right, and have the public sector deeply engaged. But in those early days, they weren't, and being able to sit with other states as well and just have that community was really important. I feel like now there's so many peer communities and so much activity in the field, which is wonderful. That's what we've all wanted, right? Was to see this grow. But in the very early days, this was a really unique thing that you all were able to sort of get going and continue to manage. So just a note of gratitude and thank you. Barbara and Phyllis and I are getting nostalgic on the private chat. And so but, hold those experiences very dear. So thank you.
I think hearing Ann talk reminds me to say that, states really still, most of them do not have anybody appointed to do that kind of collaboration. And so that's one of the privileges and the opportunities of being engaged with Bill and having ECFC is that we can make space to create the table that Ann described. But it shouldn't be lost in us that without a race to the top or without a PDG, often there isn't a leader in the state to be that glue, as you described, to be the place that brings individuals together. So I think that patient capital and that reminder that we still have a lot of work to do in states to make space for collaboration, that we're still very siloed, very transactional, and that this is a novel idea and that there are places we haven't reached. You talked about the 50-state strategy. We're making space for learning, but there are places that are going to be more difficult as we go forward, where we have to go learn, hang out, and lean in.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And I think the value of Build is that they are trying to work with the people in government who are going to stay, but often the people above them change and their priorities change and shift. And so being able to stay the course and be consistent over time and understand and recognize the ebb and flow that will happen and the frustration that will come from that. And certainly we've had that happen in Illinois. And, I think that this is all part of what it takes and why this patient capital, whether it's the capital of all of your expertise who are out working in those states, the expertise that lives in government, the philanthropic funding, whatever it is, the persistence and the consistency of that over time and the recognition that, it's very hard to measure impact oftentimes. Now I'm 27 years almost into this field and I see so much growth in this field. It's amazing. And day to day, sometimes it feels like we're taking 10 steps backward. So I think you have to sort of help, funders, help your boards understand that and why it's so important to be there over time, because these are huge, complex things we're trying to challenge and fix and adjust and learn from and make mistakes on and get better at. And that this is, it takes a long time. You have to be around a long time.
Right. I know that we only have just a few minutes, so I am going to do a 1-minute summary of this great discussion and turn it over to Shannon and Rena to talk about what's next. I think this discussion really about 3 things you said many things, but 3 things seem to be, no matter back then or today, all this work is rooted in relationships. And relationships are the fertilizer in the ground and the foundation to do anything, no matter what is. And it takes time to develop trust and relationships. The second thing is the holistic, comprehensive, big tent approach. Everybody in the tent, everybody valued, a holistic, comprehensive view of children and families and what they need. It's not a simple thing. And I think the learning and growing, that agreeing that humbly that I don't know everything at my foundation, and that we can come together to do and have a greater impact than any of us can do alone, and really humbly enter into this relationship for learning and growing and taking risk-taking, shared risk-taking together. And finally, being willing to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, are we really doing good in the communities, in the hood? Are we doing what we intended to do? But because we have these collaborative relationships and we spent time knowing, respecting, and learning, we can take a look at ourselves and be flexible enough to change our direction as new information, new understanding, and new learning takes place. But the bottom line is we've got to do it in the context of relationship. We've got to be comprehensive. We've got to be humble. We've got to invite everybody into the tent, cross-sector, because these cross-sector things touch children and families' lives. And we got to have money. We've got to have money to support these kind of collaborative efforts. So it's been a great discussion. I got to turn it over to Shannon because we're going to be cut off in a minute now. Thank you guys for sharing. I appreciate it being part of it.
So thank you, Portia, for your very skillful facilitation and pulling out these wonderful lessons. And there was a lot of preparation that went into this, I know, from all of our panelists. So I want to thank you for that. So one of the things that came up we'll sort of transition to the last thing we wanted to do, which was talk about a program we have Monday. One area that we've talked about is growth. For both of these organizations is parent voice and bringing more parent voice in and understanding that that was something that we're all continuing to try to, maybe I shouldn't speak for all of us, but I think it's true that all of us are really thinking more about how to bring parents directly into policy making, how to bring early educators directly in. And that's something we've been working on at ECFC, even having fewer funder only spaces when we gather and convene, and having more nonprofit and grantee and parent partners. Yes. And with that, I'll get to, I think Rena is going to put up a slide. We have a program on Monday. This will be one of our last programs of the year, not our absolute last, because we're co-sponsoring one with Trust for Learning and Dr. Yoma Ruka on equity later in the month too, but I'm looking to see if it's going to pop up. On Monday, we're going to have a program I hope folks can make, a documentary called Clarissa's Battle, which was about Clarissa Dalhert in California and her parent organizing toward amazing strides in the childcare system where she lived. And we're going to have a few clips, but also we're going to have the director of the documentary and Clarissa with us. So if you get ECFC's news, hopefully you've seen that. And I don't see it coming up on the screen, but it's on our website and we can send it out after. So with that, I want to wish you all a very, very happy weekend. And thanks again to everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
There's
you.
the event page.